This morning, we've got another fantastic panel, and the theme of the panel today is Finding Recovery in the Nexus. And the question that they will be helping us to answer is transition from humanitarian assistance to development possible in a world of constant crisis? Wow, can't wait to hear that and to listen to the contributions of the panelists. And to moderate that panel, we've got Rita Larrock, Chief of Party, graduating to Resilience, AVCI, Uganda. Let's welcome her.
I'll do what the Ugandans do. Good morning, and you're welcome to this interesting session. I had hoped you would do the honors of introducing a very beautiful panel, but I'll take the chance to do it because I am very honored to have a fantastic panel this morning. So we will be talking about an interesting topic, and of course we have an interesting team coming up. And just right from a multi-sector team, I would like to introduce Tracy O'Hare. Tracy is from BHA. You must have seen her in the last couple of days. And if you haven't had tea, breakfast with her, find a chance to do that. She's the Deputy Director for USAID, BHA's Technical and Program Quality Office. It's an important office because that's where design happens. Going over, I'll be introducing Erickson. Erickson, you're welcome. Erickson is the Chief of Party of the Accelerating Recovery and Resilience in South Sudan, ACCESS, and he will be telling us about South Sudan. And then moving over to Sarah, last but not least. Sarah is an interesting candidate for us because we've been hearing a lot about Ethiopia and the context, what it looks like, but I think we also have some familiarity with the Livelihoods for Resilience program. That's quite famous. I think we've heard about it for a number of days. So you're welcome. Thank you. All right, so as we get started, it's been an interesting couple of days. We've talked about HDP, coherence, non-coherence, Nexus. We turned it into PhD. We took peace away, we brought it back, and we think it's important. We're coming to the end, and so it's a good time to think, is this thing possible altogether? On the first day, we were challenged to think about it in connection. We were told that participants generally think about it as one thing. They don't separate the basket. Should we be separating this basket? Should we leave the basket together? Should we be thinking about moving away from something to something? Yes, probably. But should we be presenting ourselves in a coherent way? Probably. So today we will answer this difficult question, and I'll just turn it over to you. We've been learning about centering local knowledge. So local knowledge in the house. So I will encourage you to log on to AHA. And there will be a question coming up there. Our big question, would like to know where you stand on this question. Remember that there is, on your notebook, you can just scan the QR code, or you can do this right here behind us. And tell us what you think about this. Do you think that it's possible? Somehow, maybe, maybe not. Yes, ish, not. Hopefully positively, without influencing you. So we have this big question. Is transition from humanitarian assistance to development possible in a world of constant crisis? And we have, yes, always, most of the time, some of the time, rarely, never. And we have a winner. I'm looking forward to this green winner. And we will get back to this question later on, especially after you've listened to this incredible panel, because I think they might influence you to think yes or no, maybe, or a lot of the time. So it looks like we are going up very positively. It's a very positive morning. Some of the time, most of the time. Okay. So as we keep getting more ideas from that, why don't we get started? And we've talked about a world of constant crisis. We've also talked about preparing for the inevitable. And as we get started, let's turn it over to our first panelist, who will just tell us a little bit about the context, so you understand the activity, the context of the country, and then give us some initial ideas about what does transitioning from humanitarian assistance to development really mean for them, for a program, for a country? What does it mean in that context? And we'll just start off with Tracy.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Good morning. My context is a very interesting office where I write emails and take part in meetings, but it's from that office that I have the pleasure to engage with folks from around the globe on issues like this, and so I really appreciate it. My role in the Office of Technical and Program Quality is to support our team that helps design BHA's RIFSA activities and supports ER4 activities, and also does a lot of the technical advising that supports our humanitarian assistance programs and designs our assistance. So that's my context. It's a little removed, I think, from the ground, but pardon me for speaking from notes. If I don't, you'll be listening to me 3 hours from now. So just in terms of what transitioning means to me, I think I started this week with a very textbook definition. It means moving from humanitarian assistance to development assistance to hopefully one day being totally resilient on one's own and not needing that kind of assistance at all at an individual level or a community level or a systemic, a national level. The last few days have challenged me to think of a lot of the different parts of transition that I think that make it more nuanced. It's a process that we as a donor and practitioner community must work through together. Even for a singular community member, it's not linear. It is something that, as we look at engaging with communities, we know that people move back and forth from different parts of needing assistance, not needing assistance, and that we often engage with communities where we have folks experiencing different levels of need all at once. Successful transitions rely on our ability to engage with those we serve so that we lift up their voices to determine their future. And I really think that that's an important part of humanitarian assistance, an important part of development assistance, and key to transitions. I think it means that we as partners must work across the nexus at every stage of crisis. And I think when there's no crisis, we need to work together. When we see something coming, in the midst of it and afterwards, it must be very intentional. For USAID, the larger global picture and drivers of humanitarian need are always top of mind: conflict, climate change, and displacement. For BHA, the transition from humanitarian assistance is critical to further strengthen the resilience to those most vulnerable to shocks and to reduce their need for assistance, which is what we're overall striving for. I just want to highlight quickly some policies at USAID that help elevate our focus on these things. The need to better link assistance is between humanitarian development and peace programming is elevated in Administrator Power's policy framework that is fairly recent. It's closely linked to the agency's priority efforts to move towards localization. And I think we as a panel, as we were preparing yesterday, just felt it important to call out that we have a lot of work to do on that. We don't even have a local partner sitting with us on the panel. And so we really want to highlight that as a place where we challenge ourselves to grow and think how we can advance localization. BHA has a strategic framework on early recovery, risk reduction, and resilience, which we call the ER4 strategy. And it is the way that we work within BHA to work across the Nexus. As BHA, we seek partnerships that support transition. We do that within our bureau when we work between our humanitarian assistance programs and our the programs that we support that are longer term, non-emergency, either early recovery, resilience-oriented, like the RIFSAs, like the programs that Rita and our other panelists work on. And we also have partnerships towards transition that are well beyond BHA. That has to do with working with colleagues in the missions, working with other USAID bureaus, working with partners, the UN and others. And of course, it's very important also that we include in those partnerships longer-term coordination and collaboration with partners like EGAD and IFIs like the World Bank and other donor governments, so that we can all work together to increase coherence. And we, as a part of my going to meetings and writing emails, for sure interacting with those institutions is a key part of moving the agenda forward. To make coherence across the Nexus work and to make those transitions more smooth.
Thank you, Tracy. I think it sets a very good pace for, not that we're influencing your question, but we know that we need to work in a certain direction. But nonetheless, I think one of the things you want to do, I'll keep reminding you about these little things as I moderate this panel. Do find the ER4 strategy and read it, if you haven't, because it might be a good cue to the direction you want to take. But just moving on, and thanks a lot, Tracy, for that pace. So we'll just hear from Sarah. What does this really mean? What does Ethiopia look like in terms of context? What's livelihood for resilience?
Thank you, Rita, and good morning, everyone. Indemina Darachu. So the Livelihoods for Resilience activity is a Feed the Future livelihoods and food security program that CARE Ethiopia has been implementing with a consortium of local partners and also SNV, our international partner. We, at the time of the conflict in northern Ethiopia, had been implementing Livelihoods for Resilience for 4 years. So we had been working within the conflict-affected northern area, soon to be conflict-affected. We had 50,000 households that we had organized into village and economic social associations for micro savings and lending. We had been doing a lot of economic empowerment, work on financial inclusion, on livelihood diversification. And so we had been heavily investing in building, and these are households that are productive safety net program households. So we had been working with them to build resilience, to be able to overcome shocks and also to graduate from the PSMP program. But the types of shocks that we were expecting were not conflict-related shocks at that time. Conflict was really not on our radar. It was not on, there was a high level of security in Ethiopia at the time. And so the shocks that we were preparing households for were more related to climate-related shocks, economic shocks, even individual household level shocks, so that they could diversify their portfolio and be able to have more options. If one of their, if their crops failed, they might have off-farm livelihoods that they could engage in. And also really working on access to finance and how to save at the household level, how to take small loans and then build up their kind of saving and lending portfolio to then get loans from MFIs. So we were implementing with Orda Ethiopia and Amhara region and the Relief Society of Tigray in Tigray region. And they had a vast number of field-level staff at that time. Then in November of 2020, conflict erupted in Tigray region. Borders were closed, telecommunications was closed. There was extremely restricted access, and there was obviously a really heightened security situation that made it no longer really appropriate to be implementing a development program or expecting households to be engaged in the same types of activities when they had much more pressing issues that they were confronted with. So at that time, we had to pause the implementation of Livelihoods for Resilience. So, a lot of the discussion has been about going from humanitarian and then transitioning back into development. In our case, we were implementing a development program, and then suddenly there was a humanitarian crisis. So we worked very quickly and collaboratively with BHA to get additional funding. So the development program kind of was paused, and then we started implementing an early recovery emergency response program, because this was just before the agricultural season was about to begin. And even though households were in the midst of crisis, we knew that if they didn't get seeds in the ground, that the crisis that they were experiencing then would increase and be even more prolonged due to really increased food insecurity, because there was no access to food, to seed coming in from outside of Tigray region. So we were able to quickly pivot with the support of BHA, and then we started implementing this early recovery program, which I will get into more detail later. Then we've been implementing the BHA program for the last 2 years, because the conflict ended up being kind of more protracted than we had initially thought. It expanded into Amhara region. We were able to then again engage our local partner in Amhara region with additional funding from BHA to do similar types of programming for livelihood investments and recovery in Amhara region. And now we are fortunately in the post-conflict period, which I am very happy about, in Tigray following the cessation of hostilities last November, which was agreed upon by both the government in Tigray as well as at the federal level. And now we are phasing out of our humanitarian response and continuing the development programming that we had started under Livelihoods for Resilience. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So Sarah gives us this new dimension. You can go not from humanitarian assistance to development, but from development to humanitarian assistance and backwards. And I think as we have this conversation, we will go later into figuring out what can you do in either phase to prepare for the next phase. Because maybe transition means sitting in between the two phases and thinking carefully about how you maneuver these two phases. But let's listen to Erickson. What about South Sudan?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rita, for this opportunity. South Sudan, as you know, is the newest country in the world. I think the 193 or so. And it has had civil war, after the separation with Sudan. This is in December 2013. And according to the humanitarian needs overview, 2023, about 9.4 million South Sudanese need humanitarian assistance in 2023. And according to the same report, we also have nearly 8 million of South Sudanese who are under IPC phase 3, which is crisis. So that tells, the magnitude of, humanitarian needs in South Sudan. Again, due to flooding, we have 1 million South Sudanese affected by severe flooding since July last year, 2022. And we also have 2.2 million South Sudanese who are internally displaced, either due to conflict or natural disasters. Again, we equally have 2.3 million South Sudanese who are hosted in the neighboring countries, mostly Sudan, Uganda, and also Ethiopia. Again, since the separation of the two countries, there was hope that development or resilience programming is the way to go. But since last decade, of course, there are alarming needs, and humanitarian partners are basically working towards addressing these pressing issues that are due to man-made and also natural disasters. And again, through USAID, Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, World Vision is implementing a three-year emergency food security programs. But also we equally have two other consortiums, and the COPs for those two programs are also here. I want to acknowledge their presence. So these three multi-year emergency programs were designed to not only provide humanitarian services to households affected by these calamities, but also implementing interventions that lay foundation to resilience. So USAID South Sudan has developed a 4-year strategic plan that prioritized 5 states, and in those 5 states, there are 13 counties. So these 3 programs are basically implementing in these 5 states, 13 counties. And due to the, I could say, fragile context, again, there was an agreement that in the event the disaster hit, then we have to leverage in our crisis modifier funds to be able to support these households so that they are able to recover quickly from shocks and continue the resilience journey. So in the context of access activity, 10% of the budget was basically allocated to support the crisis modifier. And I'll be talking more about that in the next sessions. And what we are aspiring to achieve is basically to accelerate recovery and also, improve resilience. And the bottom line is providing essential complementary services to what other humanitarian agencies are doing. So we are complementing what the World Food Program is doing. All our beneficiaries or participants who have been enrolled into food security and livelihoods services are already benefiting, unconditional food from the WFP. So it means when we talk about layering, sequencing, I believe these 3 multi-year emergency food security programs are a perfect example. Again, about a partnership. The 3 MYs are basically, although they are part of EFSP, but they have a scope of 36 months, 3 years. So it means from the beginning, we were very deliberate in designing programs that would basically lay foundation to resilience activities. So we are in the process of discussing how smooth these 3 programs can transition. And the decision has already been made. And we have quite a number of development assistance partners who are going to take over from us towards the end of this year. Of course, there are challenges. And currently, we are in the midst of developing the response plan for Sudan crisis. And so far, we have received nearly 50,000 individuals crossing the border due to the conflict that started mid last month. And again, 92% of those crossing the border are returnees, are South Sudanese returnees. And again, 90% of them cross South Sudan through the Renk border, which is in Upper Nile, where the Access project is basically implementing. Maybe without further ado, let me Thank you.
Thank you. So I think he did speak about challenges as well while he was talking about it there. And I think we had some things around crisis modifiers. Now, if you want a new cue, read about that. I think it's a good thing to have a crisis modifier. But also the other thing to think about is when you're thinking transition, there are words like resilience, self-reliance. Start thinking about those kinds of things. But maybe just listening to Sarah, just building on to what Erickson said around the challenge. What's the real challenge? What, if you had to pick one, two main things that are troublesome with this transition, what would those be?
Thank you, Rita. So I want to focus, so kind of moving post-conflict, now we're in the transitional period of trying to help households recover their livelihoods, reinvest, help the market actors recover as well. And the impact of the conflict on the private sector is really one of the biggest challenges now, both in Tigray and in northern Amhara, because these market actors were really, really heavily affected during the conflict. They experienced looting, they had damage to their infrastructure. Also specifically in Tigray, for the 2-year kind of period of the conflict, they didn't have any access to finance, completely no access to finance, because banks were closed, MFIs were closed. So in order to, and also the border to Tigray was closed. So there were no kind of official channels for commercial inputs to get into the country for them to then stock their shelves. So we had worked with agro dealers and pullet growers and feed producers before the conflict, because these are kind of the key input providers to our PSNP clients. So we had established them further out into rural areas where they had better reach to rural communities. And then during the conflict, they largely had to cease their operations. So now, as we transition back, because the households in these regions are predominantly agricultural farming households, they need inputs every year. They need seed, they need fertilizer, they need livestock inputs, they need veterinary services. So without the private sector acting, the recovery process is going to be very difficult for these households. And it also, the other kind of big challenge, even a little bit earlier in the kind of, was the uncertainty of the conflict itself. That really made the anticipation of transition hard to know what the timing or what the future was going to hold. This also made households reluctant to reinvest. So for example, in areas of Amhara where the conflict was fluid, you know, there were troops that came into Amhara region, and then they kind of moved back into Tigray region, and then they came back into Amhara region. So there were these waves of conflict, and people and businesses didn't know if it was the last wave. So is it time to restart? Is it time to reinvest in buying sheep and goats, or buying cattle? Is it time to reinvest in poultry production? Is it time to restock your shop? Is it even time to return? So there was a high level of displacement. And the uncertainty of the future, of course, you can imagine even for your own, at just an individual level, if you recently experienced huge loss, you have that very close in your mind. And you're going to be reluctant to put yourself in a position where you're going to experience that loss again. So the uncertainty then leads to kind of a prolonging of the dependence on humanitarian assistance, because the market actors are a bit reluctant or resistant to reinvest. So in both areas, even in the absence of conflict, there was still kind of a slow return and recovery of the market actors. And that really, I think, prolongs the transition, and it speaks to the importance of the P, if you put it at the beginning or if you put it at the end. the necessity of peace for stable markets is really a precondition for development to happen. Thank you.
Sure. So I would, I think just building on that, it sounds like there are many things that worsen each other in a context of crisis. And I think you plan for this and then you get to that. But it sounds like from Sarah's submission, it might be worse if it's a conflict situation. Maybe a little better if it's drought. I don't know. But I think basically every one of those crises has its own dimensions and will affect you in different ways. But maybe just moving on a little bit, what are some of the things that we think are fairly successful in helping us deliver humanitarian assistance in a way that gets us closer to development? What are some of those things that one could do? Maybe we could begin with Erickson.
Yeah, thank you very much. Before I tackle that, I would like to highlight a few challenges that to what Sarah has basically alluded to, but of course in the context of South Sudan. Man-made, related challenges or conflict in South Sudan is very frequent, especially in the greater Upper Nile region. Since last year, September, in Upper Nile, especially in the Western Bank, Panyikan County, Fashoda, Manyo, there has been conflict between two communities, the Shuluk on one hand and also the Nuer communities. And we have had massive displacements of population towards Malakal town. And just to also recall that it's only in Upper Nile where we still have the protection of civilian, POC. There has been ongoing discussion about how do we transition the POC into IDP, but there are concerns over housing, land, and property. So this is one of the major challenges that I could say the state is facing. Then natural disasters, recurring flooding. I've talked about the 2.2 million South Sudanese who have been displaced due to flooding. That is a major issue. Then hunger as well. We have our WFP that provides food assistance during the lean season from March through August. But after that period, the expectation is that we should be able to, households should be able to harvest and be able to cater for their basic needs without humanitarian aid. But as I've already said, we have activated our crisis modifier, 3 times in 2.5 years, just to support these communities so that they're able to recover quickly. In terms of approaches that we have used on peace, we have facilitated a lot of, peace dialogue at community level, but also, peace conferences. In the last couple of months in March, we organized a peace conference that brought nearly 100,000 Nuer communities, even some Nuer refugees in other neighboring countries. That's one. Then under livelihoods, we are supporting various community groups in off-farm activities, fishing, income-generating activities, some small and medium enterprises. We are also working with mother-to-mother support groups or care groups to be able to not only build their capacity, but also, start some, kitchen gardens during the dry season. And we have, around collaboration with other partners, USAID allows us to also do cross-fertilization of ideas, not only with the 3 multi-year emergency food security programs, but with other humanitarian, partners operating in the state for layering. So I think for the interest of time, thank you.
Yeah, sure. No, I know that you'll find us in the break. You can go to the stalls and listen to more ideas about what you could do. I'll say 1 or 2 things and just wrap this session up listening to Tracy on one point around advocacy. But I do think that there is lots of evidence about graduation approach. And I think we had Boma speak about this. We know there's lots of literature. You can go to the Partnership of Economic Inclusion sites. You'll see many countries doing graduation approach programming that basically sequencing multi-sectoral, time-bound interventions that combine a number of activities that deal with shocks and include coaching, linkages, referrals. These kinds of activities have been tested to lead you towards that transition. And I think in the Ugandan context, it's quite a country. We've had certain results that are tremendous. Many ultra-poor households graduating out of fragility and moving towards resilience. I'm happy to speak more about that at the stall. But maybe just one last point from Tracy on advocacy. What role does policy and advocacy play in promoting this coordinated approach transitioning towards development?
Thanks. It's really important to recognize that it's advocacy that has put HDP coherence on the global agenda and keeps it there, and I encourage all of you to continue raising it up as an important part of our work. There are things in our systems that don't serve us, and it's vital that we advocate for those to change. There are issues when targeting doesn't overlap enough between humanitarian assistance and development assistance programs. And we as a community need to work together to advocate to change so that we have more flexible mechanisms, we have more flexible funding in order to overcome those kinds of obstacles. I think there are lots of times when we get trapped by some of the bureaucratic issues tied to different types of funding, and it is really important that we advocate at high levels, but that we also push ourselves to think creatively how to overcome those kinds of obstacles that block us from accomplishing what we need to. I think it's also really important that we just push ourselves to think creatively in terms of program approaches that link humanitarian assistance, development assistance, and peace activities in ways that we may not have thought of before. So I think it plays a vital part, and we cannot forget how important it is to raise up those issues and seek change. Sometimes we can get really bogged down in that's the way it's always been, and it doesn't have to be that way. So I think coming together today and other times is a really good example of ways that we can start to think together on how to improve things and to advocate for that. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. A lot of affirmation, eh? Very good point. So I didn't tell you about this, but I'm telling you about it now. So let's go back to AHA. There is a potential for you to put in your question right there, so we can be able to get it. And you could, so type in your question, but if you think your question has already been asked, sort of, just upvote it so that we deal with one or two questions. And you can do the same thing, scan that, or go to your notebook and scan the QR code and type in your questions. We will be able to balance this with some physical questions. So if you are a bit uncomfortable about technology, you could tell us if you have a question. You could simply put up your hand, and I encourage you to ask one question so we can be able to give a chance to others. I see a hand up right there. Do you? Okay.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, from Food for the Hungry. I couldn't type because it's quite long, sorry to say. Emergency comes with life-saving interventions, like general food distribution, health. Unfortunately, today, donor funding has been cut, even for emergency programs. And giving an example, in Uganda, food ration has been cut almost up to 50%. And there is likelihood of complete cut for a given category of people. So where do you see this in terms of achieving development versus humanitarian program success? And don't you think it may have a negative effect on the transition, especially given that it has come in suddenly? And USAID being among the donors for WFP, what's their future in regards to this? So what Uganda is doing, there is a twist in programming to focus more on production of food, but we know that the refugees do not have land. So are there other plans in terms of negotiation with the different governments and OPM to overcome this, as it may require some bit of funding? And I'm thinking this is a very great challenge when it comes to emergency response and the transition to development. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That's a compounded question, but I think your hand was up. Yeah, let's take one more question and one here, and then we will just wrap it up. I think your hand. There's no mic, sorry. Yeah. Let me share. Sharing is caring. Yeah.
Sorry, I typed it in, but it was too long, and there was no connection. So there was recently a series of 6 webinars led by USAID and Mercy Corps, proving that markets continue to function during conflict. And so I want to challenge the assertion that, oh, it's conflict, automatically we're distributing seeds, right? If my chief of party from CRS said I did not need to distribute free seeds during Darfur, I want to, we should not be going to that automatically anytime there's a conflict. And so I really want to push everyone to think about, if the market's not functioning here, like 20 kilometers over outside the war, it's there. What are we doing to really look at that market function? How far away is it? How can we be creative? How can we guard against elite capture? But we should not be assuming that just because there's a conflict, oops, no markets. That's just not true.
Thank you, Jennifer, because this actually gets at something that I had really wanted to speak to about the way that we designed the humanitarian response part of which is called Bru Tesfa. So I completely agree that there shouldn't be the assumption that if it's humanitarian funding that you just go to direct distribution, because that really undermines all of the market actors that the development programs have been working to build up, that the private sector actors themselves have been investing in. And even so, in the conflict in northern Ethiopia, during the first implementation period, there were still inputs in Tigray. So there was still fertilizer at the unions. There was still some quality seed for that year of planting. There were still obviously professionals who became unemployed quickly, who needed income kind of to sustain and maintain themselves. And building on a livelihoods and development program, we didn't want to erode the progress that had been made through our own investments as well as others' investments in the way that we delivered our support. So that's where vouchering came in. So we used vouchering for fertilizer, which was redeemed at cooperatives and unions. We used vouchering for animal health services, where we had to provide the medication because it wasn't available in the region, but we used local service providers who already had connections with those farmers and producers in their communities to deliver health services on a kind of a fee-for-service basis. We used vouchering for vegetable seed distribution so that we linked households with agri-dealers to get their vegetable seeds in small package, which kind of reestablished those kind of private sector linkages for vegetable seeds as well as for farm tools. So I absolutely agree that you should, just because it's easier, honestly, it is easier to just send in the trucks, go to the communities and do distributions. Not easy. I'm not saying it's easy because humanitarian contexts are very difficult to work in. But we really strongly felt like it was worth the additional effort to use vouchers to protect the local markets wherever we could. And that also laid the foundation for those actors to be better suited and prepared to be able to recover after the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Tracy, do you want to say something to that question?
Want is an interesting word. Thank you for the challenging question. And I think for me, I wish I had a simple answer. I do not. We are facing a world of ever decreasing humanitarian assistance budgets. We are facing a world of tightly earmarked development assistance budgets, and we have to find a way to navigate that. We at USAID have been very lucky to have perhaps more funding than some other donors in this time frame to give towards this region and other regions. But at the end of the day, we are also facing a smaller budget in years to come and starting now. And that is impacting in a very real way refugees and other people that we serve across the board. I don't pretend to know the details and ins and outs of the very specific situation in Uganda, but for sure there's a need to put thought into how those cuts are put into place and who they impact, and how to limit the long-term effects of not being able to provide the same levels of assistance. I would, the risk of throwing other people under the bus, be happy to help make connections after this panel for those who are interested in having that country-specific discussion, as I look very directly at someone. But I think that's, I hate to, I don't want to deflect, but I also am just not the very right person to answer that specific question.
Yeah. No, I would, not that I'm from BHA really, but I know that I'm looking at those kinds of people that we've been talking to. But being Ugandan and being in Uganda, I think it's a bad, good problem. Trying to be positive. So if the resources are reducing, it's forcing us to think outside the box. And it's forcing us to think what we should have thought before. Do you do humanitarian assistance forever? Do you continue to give consumption support forever? Doesn't it end? If we have evidence that there are things that you can do that can help somebody get close to that end, why not try that? So I like the way this situation is making us think out of the box, and how it's making us start thinking resilience, think self-reliance. I see certain agencies beginning to change skin, start attaining a new idea of how to work. I think it's a good challenge, and I think it's possible to maneuver around it and be able to still survive. I agree that the process, the transition towards that, towards this development should be strategic, should be done carefully, should be well thought out, and I think there is attempts to try to think through that throughout. But yes, could we pull up the, it would be nice to pull up those questions that we had on AHA and see why have so many of the largest humanitarian responses not transitioned to development over the past 20 years? Darfur, drought, DRC. In terms of resourcing, how are donor agencies pivoting and supporting the same communities across the spectrum? We didn't talk too much about partnerships and collaborations, but I think that might be a good time to speak about that. But who wants to to die in it? So, Tracy, do you want to go for the partnerships? The second question. How are donor agencies pivoting and supporting the same communities across the spectrum? And maybe we could go to either Sarah or...
So within USAID, we have very focused conversations about how we can pivot and support communities across the spectrum. That starts with things like resilience focus zones. It starts with conversations within BHA around when we're working in long-term situations, like mentioned in the first question. Where can we start to look for opportunities to change our approaches? and start working on programs like RIFSAs that help to build resilience in some of those longer term type situations. I think we've been thinking a lot about how we can challenge ourselves to, what's the right word? Use RIFSAs in places where we may not have thought it possible before. And I can't say that that's leading to anything specific right now, but very specific outcomes, very specific conversations about how we might use that as an instrument to challenge ourselves to think about where there's been protracted conflict or protracted food emergency levels of food insecurity. How can we use that as a mechanism in a different way? Yeah, I think there's so much to be said across all the various different donors, and a lot of that coordination happens at regional and country levels with missions. And yeah, I think there's a lot of good opportunities. There's a lot of missed opportunities, and for that reason, I think it's important for us to continue raising our voices.
Thanks, Tracy. I think there were many examples also in the last few days about how different platforms, donors are speaking to working together. There were examples about how, I think on the first day, bringing people together, agreeing on who does what, helped a little bit with the coordination and working across the spectrum. But
if I may, I'd just like to add in the importance of resourcing local partners as part of the coherence agenda. That in our specific context, we already had investments with Orda Ethiopia and with REST in Tigray. So they had experience, they had staff on the ground, and they were ready to respond immediately. And building up local partnerships who can be called on in times of need, I think leads to efficiency, leads to timeliness, and there was just the trust, the competency, the relationships that our local partners had in their local communities was actually completely essential for our ability to respond in that environment. So I think, CARE has a strong kind of localization push. I know USAID does as well. And I think just never leaving out the importance of, and it was discussed yesterday about some local partners, put on their peace hat when there's peace funding and their humanitarian hat or their development hat. But really that type of diversification of capacity of local partners will only lead to greater resilience in these communities.
Yeah.
I hate to pass up the opportunity to hear from the leadership of the Bureau for Resilience, for Food Security and Resilience. So if we could share a microphone with Mia, that would be great, because I think she probably has a lot more intelligent things to say than I might have.
Thanks, Tracy, and not more intelligent things, just to add on because it's a partnership. So I wanted to maybe add 3 things on from just kind of the perch that I sit, but also channeling as the agency's resilience coordinator for USAID. So first thing, and I think we've heard it as a theme, about the need to think creatively. I often think, having spent a lot of my career both on the humanitarian development side, that we tend to speak past each other and insist the other side needs to do it right or needs to do it differently, needs to do it better. But I think there are a lot of common threads, and I've really appreciated some of the conversations we've had this week with concrete examples of what's really working. The second thing, and Tracy, I think you had talked about USAID on the humanitarian side, early recovery, risk reduction, and resilience strategy and policy. I think many of you may know that USAID is in the process of updating our resilience policy. It's a bit dated, but there's been a lot of good collaboration and consultation, so we're hoping to be able to release that a little bit later this year, but our Center for Resilience is doing a lot of work on that. And then the third thing I wanted to mention is we've challenged ourselves this week to think a little bit differently and to think a little bit more creatively. One of the things I wanted to highlight, and I think you had mentioned it on referencing a number of the examples on Feed the Future. So for those that are not aware, Feed the Future is led by USAID, but it's the U.S. government's interagency initiative that was really born out of the 2007, 2008 food price crisis and some of the hikes, to look at how we could get at the development side at some of the underlying issues of poverty and malnutrition. So one of the things I wanted to mention is that we are really looking at how Feed the Future is fit for purpose and looking at some of these challenges. And one of the things we're looking at, we've had some great discussions with the missions, is there an opportunity to add more on shock response programming? How can we get some of our partners, and particularly in those areas of recurrent crises, to be thinking not only the humanitarian side, but particularly on the development side? How do we build that in? And have some great examples from the Kenya East Africa mission, but some examples here in Kenya where they're already doing that with programming. So I just wanted to mention that I think we can move collectively the needle forward. We just have to be willing to work together and think creatively. So thanks.
Thank you so much. I think thanks for the connection, Tracy. So why try to go over to, back to but this time trying to answer one more question, and then we will move over to the last question, which was our big question. So which do we take? How do you overcome the bureaucracy challenge during crisis modifiers? I think it sounds like it was quite easy. We had 4 crisis modifiers. We had, you would like to, is there a particular question any of you wants to speak to?
About crisis modifier? Yeah, so can we think about investing more in anticipatory actions rather, is it the...
Bureaucracy problem.
Thank you very much. We have rapid response activity. It's a crisis modifier in some other contexts, but we call it RRA. When a disaster hits, what we do is basically to coordinate with other, agencies through either, intercluster coordination group, ICCG, other partners at cluster level as well. And when an assessment has been decided, we conduct what we call IRNA, Initial Rapid Needs Assessment, to basically ascertain the needs. After that, we have a room to engage with BHA on how we can activate crisis modifier. So what happens is that we are looking at different modalities to provide humanitarian aid. It could be through voucher, through cash, or in kind. So we have conducted, market assessments right after the disaster, happens to basically, determine whether, the markets are functional, they are accessible, whether, the security allows affected households to be able to access goods from the markets. So once that step has been done, we submit the crisis modifier activation request to BHA, and that takes a couple of days to be able to look at that, review, and share feedback with us prior to engaging with BHA at DC level. So on average, I could say it takes like a month to be from the occurrence of a disaster to the activation of RRA. So we have activated 3 different crisis modifier, I could say, funds last couple of years, and that helps us to basically support these communities affected by floods or even hunger. Of course, if you don't carry out assessments on time, it may the support or the humanitarian assistance may not be provided on time. So you have really to be very proactive And given the fact that we engage with local authorities to monitor the context, so we normally access information on time. And we are also present in all these coordination bodies. So we, engage and also engage the local mission to be able to, allow us activate our crisis modifier. So that's what I could say. Thank you.
So on a more positive note, I think my experience has been very easy. I'm a chief of party of an activity for 7 years. That should tell you something about the way I look. 7 years in the sense that I think we had this great opportunity to be able to do some really good learning, understand what the context looks like, design for it, do some work on it, work with the cohort, adapt, do a scale up with a new cohort, and really try to tie in all the things that are working very well. So I think besides the crisis modifiers, I think there have been certain examples where a program can transition from development back to humanitarian assistance and backwards for quite a period of time. I think we need to be able to appreciate those transitions and the flexibility. And I think that all of us were hit by COVID at some point, and I felt that we had a great opportunity to do certain things in a flexible way compared to what could have been. And I think we tried to maneuver that timing quite well. But I would like us to transition a little bit backwards to where we started. Since we're talking transitions, we began this conversation asking if transition was possible. Is it possible to move from humanitarian assistance to development? So let's go back to Let's hear your thoughts about this as we do a quick wrap-up. We will also hear our final thoughts. If I recall, at the start, we had a sort of mixed reaction, but a more positive reaction. There was a tendency to move towards development, and it seemed like it was possible. Let's see if you still feel that this transition is possible in a world of constant crisis or not. And as that happens, we'll get back to it in a bit. We can start with Tracy. If you had to, if we had to, let me give Tracy a moment to breathe. Sarah, why don't we start with you? As the slide builds up, this big question, is transition possible? Yeah.
So I fall into, I think, the category that most of us did at the beginning, in the yes, but middle category with a caveat. I think that as we have really been discussing over the last 2 days, and as you've heard from us, it is not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when. We can expect that there will continue to be a crisis in the regions that we're working in. So there will continue to be a need for the humanitarian support, and then there will be periods of stability, and then we will be able to invest in development and also do both of them concurrently, which really calls for the continued and kind of expanded systems for flexibility. And I think that, specifically mechanisms like the crisis modifiers, the kind of adaptability of BHA and using the DART teams in country to kind of facilitate, quick response funding will continue to be necessary. But I also think in order to be prepared for the transition, that also really continuing to invest in resilience programming is essential so that communities are better prepared for when the crisis comes, so that the impact that it has on them can be minimized, and that then they can transition back to kind of a normal livelihood and life after the conflict is over.
Thank you. So it's moving over to Erickson.
Yeah, thank you very much. In my perspective, I believe humanitarian relief, development programs, peace building are not sequential processes or serial processes. We need HDP the same time. in the context of South Sudan, however much we are deliberate to, implement interventions that lay foundation to resilience, but the context dictates otherwise. There's a need to invest more in peace building, and I believe there should be a way, basically implementing partners, there should be a consensus on how to integrate peace in our programming. And I believe in some cases we look at, negative peace. We see peace in terms of, we frame it around security, but it should be, a community-led initiative. It should be a bottom-up approach that seeks to address root causes of conflict. I was in South Sudan between 2010 and 2013. I could say there was peace. Various partners, including USAID, were basically transitioning towards implementing development programs. But all of us, in December 2013, things changed. So I think that kind of having hybrid programming is very key. We shouldn't say, we are transitioning to development, because the Upper Nile context, in my view, the South Sudan context, we really need to, keep providing short-term, I could say, life-saving interventions. Again, looking at funding, having short-term funding does not also, create an environment that, helps resilience and development initiatives to, kickstart. I think having this long-term funding would also be an enabler. Additionally, again, there's the earmarked funding. A project comes to specifically address or tackle water sanitation-related issues. So we should also be very deliberate in terms of integrating, some cross-cutting themes into this earmarked funding. I think that is also very key. So I think having crisis modifier, is also a way to go, so that we don't let these communities that we have been supporting over the last couple of years, I could say slip back. So we have to find ways of helping them recover quickly so that they are able to continue the same resilience journey. And again, in terms of building, capacity of local actors, Access Project, we are working with 2 sub-grantee partners. They are local. They are here in this room. We basically invited them to be part of this conversation. It's also a way of, enabling them to learn. And again, World Vision is very intentional around localization. We are working with nearly 10 local partners. And we also received funding from BHA at regional level to build capacity of 13 local NGOs in South Sudan. It's a regional project, and the project manager, Stella, is also here. So I think implementing partners have to really, take that seriously and be able to strengthen capacity. Again, looking at all these community structures that we have facilitated forming, I think looking at the sustainability aspect of it, we really need to be in those communities for a long time. And whenever we meet for startup meetings, we should also communicate our end result. What is our pathway of change? What is it that we want to achieve, instead of just focusing on, activities. We'll do this, we'll do that. But they also have to have a shared vision around that. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Lastly.
Resisting the urge to say no, transition is not possible. Of course it's possible. It must be possible. But it's only possible if we step up our commitment to plan and collaborate together across the HPD Nexus, and to start doing that now, start doing it yesterday. I think that's really what makes those transitions possible. We have to be working together. no crisis, in the midst of a catastrophe, and afterwards. We have to plan for recovery together. Humanitarian actors have to be challenged to, as mentioned, plan humanitarian assistance that incorporates pathways for recovery. And we have to have discussions about roles and responsibilities clear, that the direction that we're going and how we're all going to fit into that direction. Not necessarily easy, something I think that we're all continue to struggle with, but it's our obligation to those we serve to continue working in that direction.
What a good way to end. I think it sounds positive. If I had to give you my opinion, it would be, I'm a very positive person, so I'll just go straight to the positive direction. But it sounds like from this panel, and I think from most of us here, we should be moving in the direction of possible, but we should keep an eye on what's going on in the context, and then be able to adapt, modify as we go. But keep an eye, and I would like us to think about one of the things we talked about on the first day. If you know that for the last 5 years there's been flooding, do you continue to worry and plan to stop the flooding, or do you start thinking about how to use the flooding? So adapt around how to use the crisis positively while moving in that direction. So we are sort of doing zigzag, but still going in a positive forward direction. And I think it's a good way to end. I could see that from the feedback on there was lots of yeses, and maybe just closing this session, thanking our panelists very, very much. They've been incredible. I've become quite intimate with them, and I'll miss them a lot in the next few days when I get back home. But one thing just to go away with from this session is incentive. I would like you to remember the word incentive. And I know who told me this word, and he's looking at me and saying, you stole my word. Yes. So incentive is important. What's the incentive to transition? What is the incentive from government? Is the incentive from the participant? If you have a structure where you are not incentivized to move upwards, you'll probably just hang in there and try to. If your safety net situation is so strong that it's holding you in there, you'll probably remain down and never transition. If the humanitarian assistance is so beautiful, it's flourishing, it's perfect, you just won't want to move upwards. So how do we do programming in such a way that you are incentivized to move towards development? And that could be that you can access certain things on a radar upwards that are better. And what are the metrics? I think one other question to think about as we close. What's the metrics for measurement? What does it mean really going forward? So thank you so much to this incredible team, and thank you to each of you.